Okay, right, fine. So when I talk about disconnected practices, we're talking about them in a number of ways. So that could be somebody using, say, a back channel, like say using a Facebook Messenger behind the scenes, even within a connected environment. So rather than posting something on their page, they might choose to disconnect from that public facing side of Facebook and start a conversation in a message behind the scenes, as it were. Taking that even further, you might look at when somebody receives a message, for example, on Facebook, and they can see it come through, but they don't reply to it, and they don't let the person see that they've seen the message and wait to reply when they want to reply, if you see what I mean. That's another form of kind of disconnected practice. And similarly, you see on WhatsApp, it's like when people wait from the ticks to go from 1 grey to 2 grey to 2 blue, and at what point do people respond? It's that kind of thing that I'm talking about, and how that operates and exists alongside connection. So it's not either one or the other. It's not connection or disconnection. It's how we have to disconnect and need to disconnect within our connected environments at the same time, as it were. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not about digital abstinence in that sense, although some people might want to do that. It's just more about, it's just necessary. We couldn't live in the world that we do now without being able to do that kind of thing, because not everybody wants to know everything. We don't want everybody to know everything. And so hopefully there's a little bit of room for maneuver, I suppose. That's how I think about it.
Okay, awesome. So it basically means that all the while we connect, we always also disconnect, right? Like we keep disconnecting on a kind of on a small level, disconnect on the big one. I absolutely love this. After we're done recording, I want to ask you about how do you make sure that people on the messenger don't see that you've seen the message? That's, off the record. Because I don't know how to do that. And I totally recognize what you say about, like waiting and knowing when it's seen, but also not wanting others to know that you've seen. So all this game, I totally can relate to that. So if we kind of think about it more theoretically then, so you're talking about all those little practices, but then how do you then define this connection? And is there a difference, or how can you conceptualize a difference between what you call disconnection and other form of technology non-use or misuse or refusals?
That's a really good question. That's a really tricky one. I think that going back to what I was saying before, part of my thinking around disconnection in terms of theorizing it was not wanting to see it as this thing that was a separate thing, which kind of goes against, because a lot of the stuff that I'd seen before seemed to be about things about abstinence, like Hamlet's BlackBerry stuff. It was all about turning the Wi-Fi off at the weekend, and a definite separation between the two. And I just don't see that, because even now, whilst I'm talking with you here, I'm disconnected from Facebook, for example. One might say I'm not, but then I'm still connected with it because my profile is still there. I see it in that respect. It's that's how I was trying to think about it. But then also, I think embedded within what I was trying to do was to try and understand the role, not just of us within that, but the role of like the non-human within that as well, which is, I suppose, another theoretical angle to this, because it was underpinned by what's known as science and technology studies, and this idea that within that basically the non-humans can have a material effect in our lives. And so I was kind of interested in how that plays a part in this whole process as well, in terms of what allows us to connect and disconnect. So I had people talking to me in the interviews talking about how they could only use Wi-Fi in a certain part of the house because the Wi-Fi didn't work as well there because a wall blocked it. Or like there was a case where we worked with on another project with the Imperial War Museum, and they had this app thing where you would go around and collect objects as you went around the museum. So the idea was to connect the audience, to connect visitors to the space a lot. But what they didn't realize that at certain points there were black spots in the building, so the devices wouldn't work. So again, the building stopped them from connecting in that sense. So it's like thinking about it in that sense as well. So it's about it all being this one jumbled thing, but also recognizing the role of non-humans in that and how it helps us to do that, but then also how they can stop us from doing that as well, in terms of what we're allowed to connect, what we're not allowed to connect, which goes into things about like what data, for example, can we, at least when I wrote the book, it's changed a bit now, but what data can we readily and easily get out of Facebook, for example, and how does that, what does that mean when the company Facebook, what are its corporate interests, and what does that mean for how we're allowed to connect and disconnect with it and to get access to our data? Because things like APIs and things only allow you certain things, and then that's sanctioned connection, and sanctioned ways of taking that data out from that. Whereas scraping off of a Facebook page is often like put down in terms of services not as an appropriate thing to do, but you might want to do that because you might not want Facebook to know that you're collecting that data. You want that decision to be disconnected from them. So, but the software doesn't allow that to happen officially, whereas other pieces of software do allow that to happen as well. So it's kind of, so that's a very long-winded, messy a way of describing it, but that's, I suppose they're two key things, that the idea that it's joined up with connection, but also that it's not just us doing it, it's us doing it with each other and with various non-human things. And non-human things, could be anything from walls, physical, it's screens. People talked about the size of a screen, people not wanting people to sit hiding things in front of their chests so that people couldn't see them at bus stops. Notions of safety as a non-human actor, people talking about like, oh, I wouldn't use my phone there because I might get it stolen from me. So that kind of comes in as that point, through to, obviously things like kind of interfaces, APIs, functions and features to connect on, not, sharing functions, all that, what can be shared, what can't, all of those things. So it's just a big jumbled up mess of all of that, I suppose.
I totally love that. And it kind of connects to what I was going to ask anyway. And you partly answered that on when you talked about Facebook. So I was thinking, is there a difference in how we disconnect from different platforms? Which, if I understand you correctly, would be a small part of kind of your whole continuum.
Sorry, could you just repeat? Repeat?
Yeah, so how we...
I think it says about platforms and you cut out, sorry.
Yeah, so how do we disconnect differently from different platforms? Right. Which I guess in a way is smaller part of what you just described as a range of non-human actors, right? So in a way, walls, bodies, and platforms is only part of it. But if we can still think about the other differences,
yes,
Facebook versus other platforms.
Yeah, no, definitely there are differences about how people engage in different ways with different platforms in terms of disconnection. So if we pick a few of them, I suppose, if we look at Twitter, for example, I think people interestingly talk about Twitter in terms of Twitter users a lot of the time. I like to think about Twitter accounts to some extent, because often it's not necessarily a person that is behind an account, and that allows them a form of disconnection in a sense. So often you might find people who still use pseudonyms. Pseudonyms are talked about as like almost like a thing, we're talked about as a thing of the 90s, that we only used in online communities using that language, and that now it's all the real name web, and we have to be who we are supposed to be, on these platforms. But for example, on Twitter, that people do deviate from that. Some people do, do that, but that's a way for them to kind of course, within Twitter as well, then there's the DM function, direct messaging, which again gets used in a very similar way to messaging on Facebook, in the sense that people can back channel each other and have chats with each other about stuff that's going on. At the same time, there's two streams of traffic going off, the behind the scenes world and the front. So that's an example around Twitter. And just taking the name thing again further, there's the if we looked at Facebook, there's the whole kind of cultural thing that I've seen over the past few years, which I know other people have witnessed, where people kind of put an extra word into their name, so it's not their real name. So I become Ben Light, for example. So there's that way, which is a way of kind of not just stopping people from finding them, which it can do, but it's obviously a cultural thing around kind of talking about them as a person and identity work written into others. But it is also a way of disconnecting and not allowing people to find you in particular ways, aside from the standard options that Facebook kind of offers you, as it were, as well. So there's a couple of there. And then obviously with things like Instagram, again, it could be pseudonymous in terms of how you operate with that, but also the whole kind of set of images that are produced may be nothing to do with identifying you. It may well just be pictures of art that have been taken from a gallery or various galleries over time, that, you know, it's that kind of thing. So again, which make it kind of separates you from the content in a very particular kind of way. And again, there's the messaging, so you can go back channel in and use of various hashtags as well. Will do, which is Patricia Lange talked about this some time ago in relation to YouTube. The paper in journal CMC around kind of publicly private and privately public, where she talked about people using particular hashtags. And this was a long time ago, before my work, and I kind of relied on some of her stuff. And it was about basically how people use different hashtags, for example, to create communities that other people wouldn't know about. So the hashtags didn't mean something. And so that's a form of disconnection within a public environment. Similarly, not showing their faces, using HUDs in videos, making videos variously public or private to people at certain points in time. All of that, again, I would see as like work of, in my words, kind of disconnective practice. So it does operate differently, or can operate across different kind of platforms, but also similar in some respects.
Do you think with all this, do you think there's going to be more disconnection in the future as we go along? Do you think it's going to increase?
I think I'm not really good at predicting the future, but I do think that people are becoming much more adept at how they engage with this stuff, and overall, irrespective of platform, we're all constantly learning. The problem is the platforms keep changing, and so you're constantly having to, even when you realize you've learned something, then you're having to relearn, and it's constantly changing. It's like I think I don't know. I'm going to be honest. I don't know enough about it. I do wonder about, without being technologically deterministic about things, how much our individual data is going to matter so much in the future, and how much it's much more about the much larger patterns that are seen in much larger data sets, like we see in Netflix and recommendations, and obviously the whole kind of data breach the series of data breaches that we've seen over several years. That seems to me has been seen as more valuable commercially and politically to institutions, rather than whether I've liked on somebody's cake post or not. And so whilst I think we can have and will continue to be adept at using this stuff, I think that it's a thing just for us to be careful about, because we might think that we've got a bit more security than we have. And I say that even as somebody who thinks that I kind of have a good sense of what I'm doing and what I'm doing with platforms. I think, yeah, I just don't think we're out of the woods on this one. I think that there's some real, various cases around stuff around kind of fake news, what's happened with the last US election, and whatever you believe about that, you can't deny that there is something happening there. And I think that's kind of worrying for me personally.
That totally makes sense. Okay, the last question, which is slightly kind of a different one, and it's a methodology question, because the students in an online school, obviously, there's a whole stream, as I told you, that's dedicated to digital disengagement.
Right. Okay.
And they're looking into different forms of different materials and different methods. So in terms of your work on disconnection as an everyday practice, what are the different methods, and whether those that you've employed or think other ones that like you maybe would consider, and kind of what are their advantages, disadvantages?
Right. Okay. So it's a really good question about how you study absence, if you like, to some extent, or what's not there. And I was pretty traditional when we were doing the book, and it was literally based on interviews. And I started out with the idea of wanting to understand how people engaged with multiple platforms, because I understood people were doing that, and just wanted to understand about that cross-platform usage. And then people just kept saying, no, I don't do that. No, I don't do that. So my questions changed to be, what don't you do? Rather than how do you do this? Tell me about things that you don't do and how you don't do things. And I found that was a really good, simple way of surfacing those kind of things that didn't happen or only partially happened, or I said, how do you avoid this, that kind of thing, rather than assuming it was all going to be joined up. I think that was at a very basic level, that was the thing. The other area since that, in terms of me looking at some of this stuff more generally, has been trying to understand controversies as they have arisen in particular media contexts. So I did some work on Ashley Madison and the Ashley Madison hack. And what drew me to that was, and I'm going to forget her name. It's the journalist who did all the brilliant work. Oh no, it's really annoying. It's in the paper. I've cited her extensively in the paper. I'm really sorry. Somebody might have to go back and find it. I just can't remember her name at the moment. Anna Lee, somebody. She worked for Gizmodo. She wrote a series of articles about the Ashley Madison hack. So she got hold of the data from the Ashley Madison hack, interrogated it alongside some software developers, and discovered that it was a lot of bots operating within Ashley Madison rather than individual people. And so through that, then I was able to take that work and work from her brilliant ideas, really, to then talk about how like non-humans were implicated in this so-called connected environment, and realize that actually there was an absence of humans within this and what their role was within that. So that was a way of, one way of it, it raised absence, if you see what I mean, where I wouldn't have necessarily seen it by kind of just using an application. Similarly, you know, people wrote about like Dana Boyd, I think it was quite a few years ago, I wrote the paper in Convergence around Facebook's privacy train wreck. And if you look at within that was all around that time, there was loads of media around that, which also talked about how people weren't allowed to do things, weren't seeing what they wanted. That raised the absence and thing. So it's like looking at those where controversies happen, I think, around things as well, are a really kind of good way of looking at this. More recently, I think it's also just being open to the possibility and asking the question of what is not there, and not just taking what is there, what isn't there. So we've just done I've just been doing some work with Susanna Parsonen at Turku and Kylie Jarrett in Maynooth around the whole hashtag of not safe for work. And we collected via the Twitter API 2 million tweets that were hashtagged as not safe for work, to try and, with this idea of, oh, there's hashtag publics and what's all the interactions going off, and hey, we're going to get big data, it's going to be amazing. And when we got into that data and started looking at it, what we saw was that basically it really wasn't operating, it was failing, it wasn't connecting as a hashtag, because the hashtag was really being used by a lot of bots, and it was bots sharing links to campsites with other bots and generating this thing that looked like it, but it wasn't. And it was literally the same tweet after tweet after tweet after tweet, robotically. There was no real participation or connection from humans within that. And then what we did some more searches and realized that actually, if people wanted to follow things that were not safe for work, or wanted to have a community around it, they would use much more specific hashtags. Say, for example, the name of they would follow a porn star or a porn company or a particular joke site, rather than use that hashtag. So again, that was another way of looking at absence, I suppose. I think it's just really being open to that idea that things aren't necessarily going to happen or be there, and just think, in STS, there's this concept of symmetry. It's like, always look for the opposite. And I think it's trying to just think about that. And sometimes there will be more of that or less of that in terms of the non, as it were.